Welcome to the Star Chamber. I'm Ryan Swayze, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the founder and president of the Walk the Talk Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for and advises currently serving and former military service members going through the arduous journey of administrative processes and investigations in our government.
And I am Francescagraham, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisor for the Walk the Talk Foundation. For all our returning guests, welcome back. And for our new listeners, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this week's topic, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, check out our Walk the Talk Foundation website, and hit that donate button if you think we're doing a good job. Also, check out our newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, on all the socials, including LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. Links in the description. All right, Star Chamber listeners, let's get started. Welcome back, Star Chamber listeners. Today we are doing a special episode of the Star Chamber, and we are doing this episode in response to Secretary of War Eggshells' recent September 30th, 2025 policy memos and speech that he gave to all of the U.S. senior military leaders concerning the reform of the IG, the Military Equal Opportunity, and the equal employment opportunity systems within the Department of Defense. We wanted to do this special episode because we believe that the reforms that he proposed fail to address the systemic and structural flaws that we as the Walk the Talk Foundation have been identifying and advocating against for at least the last 3.5 years. So the format that I'd like to follow for this particular episode is I'm really just going to be interviewing Ryan. As the president and founder of our foundation, I thought it was important to really talk through the whole story arc of where we started as a foundation and where we are now and why we believe that this response to the September 30th, 2025 remarks by the Sec War are important for you to hear. So, Brian, welcome to the show as the co-host.
Good morning.
As always. So really the first question is, to start our story arc, why did you start the foundation?
Well, the foundation was begun really because of two events in my professional life. The first was having been an inspector general within the Air Force, having seen the flaws and the shortcomings and how the system is easily manipulated and corrupted by the chain of command. And then the second event was as a victim of two reprisals and really restriction as a member of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and taking my case and my complaint through each and every level of the IG system, through each and every level of the chain of command, seeking redress and seeing exactly how the system betrayed me at every level, how the IG system purported itself to be an independent watchdog, but instead really was just another arm of undue command influence. And it's from those two events where I started thinking, okay, this is probably not an individual-centric issue. This is probably an issue endemic of the entire military and perhaps Coast Guard as well.
And so you started the foundation in January of 2022. So we have been in operation for approximately 3.5 years, almost. And in June of 2024, we released a seminal report.
The full title of the publication is the Department of Defense Inspector General System, Independent Watchdog Turned Institutions Lapdog. And it covers what we saw as systemic failings, highlighting 6 themes. Number 1 was a lack of due process and transparency. So there's very few rights. There are very few rules that are followed. They don't mirror, this administrative system doesn't mirror a criminal system in any sense of the word, or any kind of constitutionally derived rights to due process. It's not beholden to. There's very little transparency throughout. The second theme is there's conflicts of interest because inspectors general throughout the services are subordinate to commanders. So there is an inherent conflict of interest there. The third theme is inadequate training of inspectors general and command appointed investigating officers. We'll delve into that as we talk about our response letter later. The fourth is lack of timelines and lack of timeliness in investigations. The fifth theme was a link to the military suicide and mental health crisis. So as these investigations drone on and complainants are isolated and gaslit, they suffer, in some cases, irreparable mental health harm. And then the final theme was a normalization of deviance, which is to simply say, if an organization is willing to accept minor infractions, such as not adhering to the very few timelines that do exist for investigations, they're more willing to turn a blind eye to other infractions, which they do with frequency.
Such as one of our favorite episodes is returning FOIA requests with entire full pages completely redacted, even though the full pages were the emails that the complainant, the FOIA requester themselves had sent, but they redacted those full pages. Normalization of deviance, we call that.
Exactly.
So what are some efforts that we as a foundation, since our conception in January of 2022 up till now, what are some key efforts so far that we have undertaken to address the systemic and structural flaws that we identified in the Lapdog report?
Well, aside from the individual casework, which is the bread and butter of the foundation's mission, we're at about 460 some odd cases at this point in our 3.5 years. We work also to address root cause, aka systemic issues, and the thrust of that has been legislation as well as executive order drafting. You mentioned the Lapdog report. We drafted that in 2024. From those themes, we generated 4 overarching remedies in suggestion to addressing those issues. Number one, first and foremost, is a creation of an independent entity. Right now, with IGs being subordinate to commanders, and in fact, the Army regulation goes so far as to say IGs work only for commanders, quote unquote. There's no independence, and there needs to be independence. So that's remedy number one. Number two is increased oversight and accountability. There are the council, such as the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, aka SIGI. There are also a few congressional committees designed to perform oversight duties. They don't sufficiently, so that needs to improve. The third is improved and increased training. Right now, inspectors general in the services receive about 4 business days of training. Augmentee investigating officers receive no training and have no experience in the investigative arena. That's frankly scary. That needs to change. And then finally, mandatory timelines for the completion of investigations. Right now, by law, investigations can go ad infinitum. They could go forever and still be legal, quote unquote. And that's a shortcoming in the system that needs to change as well. So that was the Lapdog report. From that, we derived language for the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, which said, hey, if nothing else, let's address the training aspect here now. We can do that now. We can spin up these investigators and inspectors general to at least be some semblance of professionalism. Right now, by and large, throughout the Department of War, they're taken from their primary duty, these inspector generals and these IOs, these investigating officers, and they're thrown some training, they're thrown some slides, and then they're put in charge or they oversee investigations that have very serious potential ramifications for the service member, up to and including being dismissed from the military. It's an important responsibility, an important role that they are underqualified and undertrained to. And prior to that, we had drafted a executive order to be in line with President Trump's campaign promises to remove inspectors general from the influences of their superior officers in the creation of an independent inspector general entity, both in the Department of then Defense, now War, as well as Homeland Security. So those have been our legislative and executive order actions taking that to address root cause and systemic issues within these systems.
And I think it would be fair to say that the response that we received from our members of Congress that we engaged was not terribly enthusiastic. Can you
Exactly, yes.
reflect a little bit on why you think that was?
Yeah, the response has been tepid at best. Very few members seem to be interested. Some of the committees, in fact, responsible for oversight, such as Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee, also have been very slow to react, quite honestly. I can't speak on their behalf as to why. I just know what we see, and that is this feeling of kind of malaise, this feeling of defeatism, this feeling of, well, this is difficult, so we're not going to endeavor upon it. So, I'm sad to say, but I have to say it. I have to call it as I see it. Congressional response has been lackluster at best.
And I think one small story I'll share on that I was particularly struck by was when I was sharing the NDAA proposal on mandatory training. I was sharing one of the offices I was sharing it with was a Republican office in February, end of February, beginning of March 2025. So shortly after President Trump took office. And I mentioned one of our key concerns with the structure and systemic flaws of the IG and EO systems within the DoD was recruiting and retention problems because that had been reported on by numerous organizations, including Wall Street Journal, New York Times, et cetera. And we see it with our clients. And the response from this particular congressional staffer was, oh no, since President Trump took office, there's no more recruiting retention problems. Everything's skyrocketing. So there seems to be this little, potentially a little bit of cognitive dissonance with what the problem is, and then what we're saying the everything's going to be fixed. So that's kind of a good transition into, given President Trump's March, I think it was March 2023 video that point six, I believe, was that we need to have IGs that are fully independent from the organizations that they inspect. And then also given moving forward to April 2025, Secretary Hegseth's press release on this idea of no more walking on eggshells. So can you kind of walk us through some of the key indicators that we've seen as a foundation that made us cautiously optimistic that the things that we identified, the administration was going to fix those things?
Yeah, and first, before I do that, I think it's important to emphasize this issue is agnostic of your political leanings. This IG system has been faltering and arguably broken through several administrations, left and right of the aisle. His GAC has been chaired left and right of the aisle. SIGI has appointees from both administrations, as does the Department of Defense, now Department of War, Inspector General. So remove the political leaning from the consideration, because this has been ailing for quite some time now. But there was hope for reason for cautious optimism, I guess, leading into this administration, given the President Trump's remarks about creating an independent inspector general. He had removed the Department of Defense's inspector general. He's also moving to defund SIGI, a move we applaud as well. And then it led to Secretary Hegseth mentioning that he was looking to reform the military's IG and EO systems. So these were signs for potential hope, potential optimism. Unfortunately, the first real official announcement, which came in April of 2025 from Secretary Hegseth, with his release, or his introduction at least, of the no more walking on eggshells policy, he made several allusions to a pattern that he would later mention in his September 2025 speech. And the pattern was this not so ambiguous allusion to the typical complainant, what a IG and EO complaint looks like. And his quote was, "I've heard it many times," end quote, And then in April as well as September, he postulates this not so hypothetical scenario in which you have a low performing individual, an ideologue, as he quoted in September, and then along comes an NCO, a leader, a commander, trying to uphold, trying to enforce standards on this low performer, who in then turn files an IG or an EO complaint in order to derail that person's career, thereby weaponizing the system. This was the first indication in that April announcement that reform of the IG system was perhaps not taking the turn we wanted it to.
We're back with more reforms here at DoD, and this one is one of the most important ones we've done. The official title is Restoring Good Order and Discipline Through Balanced Accountability. A little wordy, but over the target. The real title that I call it, the No More Walking on Eggshells policy. You see, too often at the Defense Department, there are complaints made for certain reasons that can't be verified that end people's career.
And what were some other concerning signs that we've seen in the last 8 months? And again, back to Ryan's point that this is not a partisan statement. These issues that we are identifying, we have both read congressional testimony dating back to the 1980s talking about the same issues that we're talking about here. We need an independent IG, we need mandatory timelines, there's conflicts of interest, et cetera. So in addition to, I'll say, not just our 460 plus currently serving former service members and federal civilians that we've helped, but also the, as of today, 52 open client cases since of, again, currently serving former and federal civilians. What other signs have you seen that have made us a little bit concerned leading up to the September 30th, 2025 speech?
Well, I think the sign for concern is the lack of signs, insofar as there was no substantial or any type of reform measures introduced after the removal of Mr. Storch. That was the former Department of Defense Inspector General. But since then, or following that removal, there were no policies, no programs put in place, nothing substantive in terms of actual reform, actual improvement or betterment of the system. That then begged the question, well, what comes next? And it wasn't until really September, just this past week, where we had that answer.
All right, so we've walked now up to September. Describe for our listeners, our viewers, because we're publishing the video, describe for our viewers the September 30th, 2025 speech, and then also the memos that were released, because they're a little bit different. I think in one of my notes to you, I mentioned that if you read the memos, they seem relatively measured. If you listen to the speech and don't read the memos, I would call it very unmeasured and rife for potential for many abuses. So if you could describe those for us.
Yeah, so the first thing to discuss, I think, was when we got word that there were planned reforms of the IG and EO system. Again, we had cautious optimism. We agree that there needs to be reforms and significant ones. But then the speech commenced, and it's about a half an hour into the Secretary of War's speech where he introduces his no more walking on eggshells policy. But just before that, if you listen to the speech, how he tees that segment up, I found to be incredibly telling.
Truth be told, for the most part, we don't need new standards. We just need to reestablish a culture where enforcing standards is possible. And that's why today, at my direction, I'm issuing new policies that will overhaul the IG, EO, and MEO processes. I call it the No More Walking on Eggshells policy. We are liberating commanders and NCOs. We are liberating you.
We need to dissect that segue, I think, very carefully, because the Secretary makes a link, really a non sequitur, in my opinion, between leaders that feel like they cannot enforce standards and the IG and MEO processes. His not so ambiguous link here, this cognitive bias that he introduced in April and then explicitly spelled out in a speech in September, says that the MEO and IG processes really are and have been put into place to weaponize or be weaponized against leaders just trying to uphold people to standards. And it empowers low-performing individuals who are not abiding by those standards to derail people's career. And he goes so far as to say that
we are overhauling an inspector general process, the IG, that has been weaponized, putting complainers, ideologues, and poor performers in the driver's seat. We're doing the same with the equal opportunity and military equal opportunity policies, the EO and MEO at our department.
So he spells it out. He says, this is what has become of the IG and MEO system. It is a weapon for low performers to derail high-performing and upstanding leaders, NCOs, and commanders.
And just to be balanced, what are some aspects? Now, I don't think he really said much during his speech that we particularly agree with, but there were a couple points in the memos or concepts in the memos that we agree with as a foundation. So what are those things?
Yeah, timeliness and training were touched upon in two separate memos, especially when you talk about the individual augmentee investigating officer. So to spell that out a little more explicitly, there are a vast number of investigations not completed by the inspector general or their investigators. They're actually tasked out to the command to be accomplished as command-directed investigations, or as the Army calls them, 15-6. Those investigators are just random people selected via dice roll, essentially, who have no training. Some get some slides to read through, whether they do or not, who knows, and then they commence an investigation with, again, potential serious ramifications. In the memos, their training or their need to be trained is addressed, and we agree with that. And the second aspect we agree with is timeliness. Investigations need to be accomplished in a timely manner because both for complainant and subject, this proverbial Chinese water torture of waiting and waiting is mentally straining, taxing on your personal life, your family life. And then justice delayed is justice denied. If you come back 3 years later and you tell a complainant, yeah, you were wronged, or a subject, you're in the clear, it really does nothing. They can't turn back the clock. So those investigations need to be done much more quickly. The naysayer, of course, will say, well, then there's pressure to get them done and they won't be done well. And the answer to that is easy. Well, they're not being done well now, so at least let's get them done quickly.
And I think something we'll address as we kind of walk through the things we do not agree with is when we talk about the timeliness aspect, nowhere in either the memos and actually the opposite in the Secretary of War's speech does the concept of timeliness relate to anything Ryan was just saying, justice for the person who reported misconduct and or justice for the person who's under the subject of the investigation. It's just close the investigations within 30 days, no questions asked, because we don't want to have a negative pall placed on people, especially subjects of investigation. When we think about, again, what Ryan was saying earlier, how the complainants, the ideologues, and what was the third one, Ryan?
The poor performers.
Poor performers have weaponized the system and are in the driver's seat. We can see where the prioritization is. It's not on the people who report misconduct. So now stepping into kind of the major sections or areas that we as a foundation disagree with.
Yeah, and this is a much longer list. And it starts with the model, the mental model that is shared with us both in April and September as to, okay, this is how complaints pan out. This is how they play out. And more saliently, perhaps, this is what your typical complainant looks like, right? And again, both in April as well as September, it was formulated as you've got this dirtbag who's being held to a standard and he's trying to take the people out who are holding them to the standard. and they use the IG and the EO process to derail them. There's no mention about any founded allegations brought up by complainants. There's no mention about actual violations of rule and law. There's no mention about whistleblower protections. There's no mention about the psychological, emotional toll that complainants with actual, legitimate, and credible concerns have that they suffer. None of that is formulated as the IG and EO process has been weaponized, and we need to undo that. So that's the introduction. And in the speech, and again, kind of to reiterate, he tees it up by saying, we need to be enforcing standards, and we need to have an environment through which and by which leaders can enforce standards. And that's why we have to reform the IG policy. He makes a direct and inextricable link between what he perceives as the inability for leaders to hold people to standards and this weaponized IG and EO process. It is a cognitive bias that has no basis in fact or data that I've seen as a former inspector general, that I've seen throughout my 2-year+ case through which I was able to affect legislation. It's not based in any fact or data that we've seen from our 460+ cases at the foundation.
And to that point, of the 460+ cases that we have seen at the foundation of people that we've advised, every single one of them has whistleblowers have been, in fact, high performers, seasoned officers, enlisted members, or federal civilians with 10+ years in service who find themselves battling against their command and the weapons that the command are using, i.e. the IG and the military equal opportunity systems, to fight for their career after they legitimately reported legitimate misconduct. So moving forward then, can you talk a little bit about how, and you've touched on this quite a bit, but very specifically talk on how the Secretary's speech plus the memos shifts the burden of scrutiny onto the complainant and why we think that's a problem.
Yeah, and it's important to reiterate, I think from our experience at the foundation, 3.5 years, and you hit on it, but I'm going to say it again at the risk of repeating ourselves, what an actual complainant looks like in their experience. So like you said, and our mean client or median is 05, grade rank of officer 05 plus or minus, and they have in average 17 years of service, honorable service, flawless records, and that's indisputable because we see their records. And they file complaints not because they were targeted, not because they were held to standard, not because they're poor performers as witnessed by their record, but because they see or are victim to a wrongdoing. They see a regulatory infraction or breaking of the law, and they try and work it through their chain, who summarily crushes them, and then they seek redress if they still have the gas in the tank through the IG system, which substantiates in the terms of reprisal at 1.7% rate. That's 98.3%, if my math is correct, of reprisal complaints. And I'll make links to other administrative complaints here in a second. But by the DODIG's own admission, almost 99% of complaints are already unsubstantiated in the reprisal and restriction regime. That includes both reprisal and restriction. So these complainants have a very long road to hoe. It's very high risk. They pay a high cost. They begin as high-performing officers and enlisted people, just trying to do the right thing, doing what was told was their duty, and they're systemically eviscerated by it. That's really what a typical complainant's path is like. Very few, vast minority follow this mold that the Secretary has laid out, where it's just a dirtbag trying to get revenge. That is not reflective of reality, and I cannot emphasize that enough. But now let's talk about the execution of the policy. And I'm going to read from the memo here, and this is in terms of the initial vetting. of a complaint. As permitted by law, apply uniform, legally sound thresholds to ensure formal investigations are initiated only when clearly warranted. The 7 duty day credibility assessment must remain distinct from the investigation to prevent unnecessary delays, personnel holds, or premature external notifications. An investigation should be initiated only if the complaint meets credible evidence standard. Now, at face value, that sounds like a legitimate policy. However, when you look at the history and the data of complaints and complainants throughout the IG system in the last few years, and then you really delve into the verbiage, there's pause for concern here. First, as permitted by law, apply uniform, legally sound thresholds to ensure formal investigations are initiated only when clearly warranted. Well, who defines that? And who vets that? And the answer is the same judge, jury, and executioner that's allowing or has carried out the wrongdoing, likely. And that is the chain of command and or an inspector general who works for that same chain of command. So this vetting process, while on paper, in an academic sense, seems sound, in execution, it opens a person up for extra scrutiny, and that person being the complainant. And that's a theme we're going to see throughout here, is that the burden of proof, which is already exorbitantly high, even though it should just be preponderance of the evidence, the burden of proof is further shifted onto the complainant, adding stigma, adding rigor, in a system that already has an incredible amount of stigma and rigor on the complainant already, given that very low substantiation rate and given the after effects and retaliatory actions that likely occur to that complainant.
So what do you think the unspoken intent is of both the speech and the memos?
It was crystal clear to me, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, Francesca, but it is, if you are a complainant, we are going to put the screws to you. And it is going to be open season on people because they are poor performers, they are ideologues, they are whiners, they are complainers. So it imparts a chilling effect on anybody who would be a complainant or existing complainants because of that label. You notice in the speeches, both in April and September, there was never a mention, save for being a racist and sexually harassing someone, that any complainant could have a potentially legitimate concern. That was non-existent in speeches as well as the policy memos. So the bias and the skew is clearly to empower commanders and the chain of command to eviscerate complainants, to put the screws on them, to add the stigma, to shift this sometimes insurmountable burden of proof on them, adding emphasis again on the rights of the accused. That's a theme we've heard in the past few months as well. In a system that unsubstantiates 99% of allegations, many times against the command, I struggle to see how rights of the accused continues to be a priority, how shifting the burden of proof on the complainant in an already arduous process should be a priority. But that is clearly the emphasis, both from the memo as well as the speech.
And I'd like, Ryan, just to illustrate that point, harken back, 10, 15 years, whatever it is, to when you were an inspector general in the Air Force and you did an inspection of your wing. You provided the report to the wing commander, and it identified that there were some significant issues within the wing that needed to be fixed. And what was your wing commander's response to your report?
Yeah, essentially it was, I hired this guy, the guy being the commander of the unit we inspected. I know he's sharp, so the unit must be good. So all your work and your team's work is summarily dismissed, and I'm going to alter the report and the grades. And that is indicative of this non-independent system. I chuckle every time I hear on the news or I see in DoD IG publications or what have you, independent watchdog. It's a farce. IGs are subordinate to the commanders they work for. And those IGs, by the way, are people with careers, with annual performance assessments, with promotions, with assignments coming up, who are beholden to this commander who, whatever he or she says goes. And if you challenge that, you sometimes are putting your career in jeopardy. So the natural result is, of course, when you're faced with this decision between your loyalty to the truth, and your loyalty to yourself and your career, many times people opt for the latter, and understandably so, being humans. So that's an issue that's completely absent in any of the new policies or any new reforms, is independence, which is a starkly and markedly absent reform and policy change, despite President Trump's statements now 2 years ago approximately that we need to reform the IG system to be more independent. There has been zero movement to that effect. So on to other things that are absent in the policy that really need to be is training beyond just the investigating officer training. We need to address the fact that inspectors general are woefully undertrained and underqualified. Again, 4 business days. I mean, imagine if you had a lawyer on retainer who was representing you and had 4 business days of training, or a police officer who was investigating a crime that infected you that had 4 business days of training. It is not adequate. And again, it's not addressed. Now, this is important because this plays both ways. The secretary is clearly concerned about the weaponization of the system. Well, weaponization is really defined as an unfounded allegation that goes substantiated. That is weaponization. When I say, hey, you tried to uphold me to a standard and I'm a poor performer and ideologue, I want to take you out, I'm going to sling an accusation at you and it derails you. That's because that unfounded allegation was substantiated, because the investigation was not done correctly, because it was done by amateurs, because it was done by undertrained and underqualified people. That's the root cause of this issue, is the training and qualification. And again, that's completely absent, save for the investigating officer, the augmentee. It's not addressed in terms of inspector general training, and should have been.
And so the actual term for people who report misconduct is complainant. And that can be shortened to you're a complainer, which of course has negative stigma stereotypes associated with it. And I think one could argue that if you're labeled a complainant, then you are someone who is mucking up the system, you're rocking the boat, and you're thereby interfering with the Secretary of War's priority, that President Trump's priorities, to increase readiness, focus on war fighting, good order and discipline, etc. So can you kind of talk through some of those psychological aspects at play when we use these words, which, complainant, that is the actual word, but what it really, really means is that you are reporting some sort of misconduct that could actually negatively impact the readiness of your organization.
Yeah, and the unfortunate part is that on paper and in the academic sense, the whistleblower program is quite genius, right? You want people to identify risk, shortcomings and readiness, etc., to the chain of command in an environment free from retribution, such that you can curb and mitigate those risks. That's the whole purpose, and it's sound in purpose. But then you enter in human emotions, such as power and ego and threat and rescue and those types of things. And the complainant, and of course it's a terrible word when they file a complaint, another terrible word, is seen as just someone questioning your authority, calling the sanctity of the institution into question. And I can say that beyond a shadow of a doubt because we see the reactions by leadership, by the chain of command to these complainants. They're labeled a boat rocker, they're besmirched, they're befamed, they're derailed, in fact, not the other way around. because they're seen as these agitators. Whereas what they're really doing are highlighting regulatory and legal infractions occurring within the organization in an effort to make it better. But the chain of command then circles the wagons, typically in collusion with the IG, judge advocate, EO, what have you, to take out the boat rocker. And the thing that's never addressed in many of these cases is the infraction itself. So you have a huge and ever increasing now delta between the academic idea, the spirit of whistleblower systems, protections, laws, etc., and the execution thereof.
I think the last two things I'd like you to talk to are, number one, again, going back to the median age rank of at least the people that we see at Walk the Talk Foundation. Is this the first time that that person has ever seen misconduct? Because there's this belief within the groups of people who like to say complainers, complainants, you're rocking the boat, you're mucking up the system, that they have just had this perfect career and now they see some little piece of misconduct and they're going to become an ideologue. I think that's kind of the impetus of that idea, ideologue, right? And then along with that idea, is it the first time they've seen misconduct? And if not, why are they reporting it now? What are some potential reasons why they might be reporting now if it's not the first time they've seen misconduct? And then the last big piece is, what is the true impact to the real toll on our people, our readiness, and our nation by these reforms presented by the Secretary of the War?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Francesca. Is like what makes a whistleblower? And another term I don't particularly like, but to define it, a whistleblower is just someone who reports a wrongdoing, right? And by law, under Title 10, U.S. Code 1034, they're afforded automatically legal protections. Automatically, they need not declare it. But what makes them a whistleblower? What trips them to say, okay, enough is enough? And I think it ties to, we talked about the median demographic of the client of the foundation, which are fairly seasoned officers and enlisted members. We advise up to 08 now, so two-star general. The median is 05 with 17 years of service. These are seasoned individuals, people who have seen a lot and experienced a lot. Combat experience as a commander, leadership experience, etc. And I think what brings them to this point is that as they go along in their career and they're told what should be and they're told what must be, whether whistleblower protections or the law or regulations, and they're told about core values and integrity, and then they see this disparity in what's really happening. In other words, hey, I'm told this should be happening, but I'm seeing this. When that disparity, when that delta grows to be big enough, they say, okay, enough is enough. I need to address this. And that begins their whistleblower journey. And so let's talk about the second part of your question, which is the cost. A lot of emphasis has been placed on readiness and the warrior ethos and being ready to go to war, things we can't vehemently agree with enough. This is all about readiness, in fact. What we work is directly contributing to the readiness and the betterment of the defense. Let's talk about some statistics. Some we've introduced already, some might be new to our listeners and viewers. As of fiscal year 2023, the most recent, at least, report on suicide prevention in the military, 29% of active duty suicides in calendar year 2023 involve members undergoing a legal or administrative investigation. So that emotional toll, that psychological toll of these investigations and processes is real. And when you're going through that, you are not combat ready. Your mind is not in a place to execute the mission. And so timeliness and accuracy and professionalism of an investigation, unbiased investigation, is important to the readiness of the member and thereby the readiness of the nation. 90+% of Walk the Talk Foundation clients suffer some degree of mental health trauma and or moral injury. Again, this theme was markedly absent in the speeches and the policy memos. That long slog, that glacial process, has an effect on a person's psyche and their families. Several clients of our foundation have had suicidal ideations. Some have attempted suicide. Some have attempted suicide multiple times. Again, that concern is not aired. So there's that. And then there's the moral injury aspect, which we brushed upon earlier, that I want to reemphasize. You have people, just like our median clientele, several years of honorable, flawless, perfect, some could say, service, who then go through this process, this IG and EO process. They've seen a wrong, they know there should be a remedy, they know there should be redress, and it doesn't happen. From that arises moral injury. That is also an issue for national security and readiness, and here's why. When you have someone betrayed, they're far less apt to find that warrior ethos spirit for an institution that has sold them out, quite frankly. And they leave. They are not retained. And when they talk to their friends and family about service in the military, they tell them their story and they don't join. There are secondary and tertiary effects to this as well. This, again, is not discussed, but it is a real thing. When people are despondent, when they become discouraged, let's say, when they feel like they are betrayed, they walk. And their children don't join, and their friends and their family don't join. And that is a real threat from this failed IG and EO system. Again, this is not just about, quote, leaders who were derailed, which again is a minority of the cases, vast minority. This is in both directions, complainant, subject, even witness. When they see the system fail, when they see what the military has told them should occur, bylaw protections, no retaliation, legal avenues of redress, and none of those occur, that creates despondency. And that creates, in essence, a person who doesn't want to serve that institution anymore and who doesn't want to see their family serve either.
And for our listeners who are not in the military and who like the fact that our country is served by a group of men and women who protect our national security and fight to protect our national security, what has history taught us about the impact to national security, the impact to an actual warfighting force if there is a targeting against people who report misconduct within the service?
There are too many exemplars to list. The militaries of history that have erased truth tellers in whatever form or fashion, and what has become of those militaries and those nations. It is a disconcerting sign to see what's becoming of ours.
And I think that concludes our show. Ryan, really appreciate the time. To our listeners, please get involved. Check out our foundation at walkthetalkfoundation.org. If you would like to help us to continue this fight for justice for our servicemen and women and for our federal civilians so that they can continue to tell truth, to make sure that our military forces are actually prepared, actually equipped, and actually trained to fight our nation's wars.
And I'll close by saying the men and women who swear an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution should enjoy the rights thereof. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Well, that's it for this week's topic. We really appreciate you tuning in. Don't Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out our foundation website at walkthetalkfoundation.org.
And feel free to reach out and give us feedback. You can get a hold of us via Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our foundation's website. Details in the description section. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next episode.